Today's episode, if you are missing out, is sponsored by Fiverr. You may know Fiverr as the preferred source for freelance services, but did you know that they also provide online courses as well? Learn from Fiverr is an online, on-demand video classes platform specially tailored for freelancers and professionals. All classes are taught by top experts who are distinguished in their fields. These courses contain practical and comprehensive knowledge. By taking the course, you'll level up your skills and grow professionally. And by successfully passing the course's final quiz, you'll showcase your new capabilities. And the best part? Pay only for courses you want to take, with no monthly fees. Visit our show notes for more information to see if there's a Learn from Fiverr course for you. Every course you enroll in using our link goes directly to making this show better. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
Gentlemen, what's a movie that redefined a genre for you?
It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's my favorite movie of all time, and growing up, my father was, westerns would be on. It must have caught in my subconscious or whatever, and it was never something I hated, but it was never something I loved. Whatever, I wasn't that into it. But then, because Quentin Tarantino said Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was his favorite movie of all time, I was like, all right, well, I guess I should see that. And I watched it, and it kind of just cracked my head open. It really showed me what westerns could do, that they were not locked into one thing, that they could be anything. They could, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is this big, grand epic about the greed and folly of man. But then, you get deeper into westerns. They could be these small little character pieces that Bud Bedecker made with Randolph Scott. They could be, they could be anything. They could be Django Unchained. They could be 310 to Yuma. And the western is now probably, outside of horror, westerns probably my favorite genre of anything. And when it comes to my writing, I think everything I kind of write tends to either be a western or has like a western influence in it, or ends in like a very western way. Yeah, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in like many ways is my answer to questions that we do. And yet again, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was that for me in this case.
For me, maybe it might sound a little odd because it's not necessarily one somebody jumps to as like, when we're talking about game changers or anything. But for me, I think back to when I was very young, and like I had seen romantic comedies growing up, and romantic comedies were always the same thing, which is it's funny antics about two people who eventually fall in love, and in the end they kiss and they get married happily ever after. And that's still most romantic comedies, right? As we want to see people get together. I remember I was very young, so most of the jokes didn't even register to me. But my mother had rented me Annie Hall. And, it sounds very silly now, but especially how young I was and my understanding of film, the movie ends with them not together. And Annie Hall, watching it felt special because you're like, oh, this is not like all romantic comedies are, Instead of crazy antics of like people mistaken identity, you have that great sequence with the lobster in the kitchen and all of that. But I just remember it ending with, and I met up with Annie. I ran into Annie outside a movie theater, and she had a date, and she was taking him to see The Sorrow and the Pity, and it plays Seems Like Old Times. And as again, I was probably like 11, 12. Maybe even younger, but that felt revolutionary to me, not just for a movie to end in a way that wasn't happy or sad, to end in a way that was melancholy, and also just the entire idea, because again, when you're a young kid, like, you maybe understand relationships as like, well, this is the thing, you find the right person, you get married, whatever. Just the whole idea of Annie Hall being, we had this love affair and it was wonderful and good, and now it's over, and I'm glad it happened. It's a hell of a way to end a rom-com. It's a hell of a way to end a movie at all, and I think it really opened my mind up to what kind of stories you could tell, and that it doesn't always have to be the quest for ultimate joy or ultimate tragedy. So Annie Hall, for me, really redefined the genre. Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we travel to space with filmmaker Ian Faria to discuss 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Our guest today is a filmmaker from Long Island who directs videos with his comedy group Simpletown. He is currently in post-production on his short film What Happened to Bobby, a documentary about his grandmother's alien experiences. Ian Faria joins us today on the program to talk about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome,
talk to you guys.
welcome.
We used to know each other about a decade ago, and then I fell through a monolith into a time tunnel and aged very rapidly. And now here we are. It's been tough, but I'm here, you know.
And you are shaped like a gigantic baby, so it does fit.
Our audience has no sense of timeline, so they don't actually know whether or not like this is post surgery, whether I'm extra pudgy or not. They have no idea. We have no frame of reference.
Again, who can tell?
I don't know. By this point, our greed commentary has come out, so I've already on mic made the joke that I might die under the knife. I didn't. For anyone listening, this was recorded after that. I did survive.
This is not AI.
Mike is looking very healthy for those of us that are treated to the visual component right now. Tip-top form.
That's a lie. That's such a lie.
Let's not say healthy so much as alive.
Yeah, passable. I'm not doing those Jack Palance push-ups or anything, you know. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. This is really cool. As I mentioned, like we did know each other going back, and then you got in touch with me a couple months ago. In a way, I feel honored because I guess you had just watched Magnolia and remembered that I used to listen to the soundtrack quite a bit.
Yes.
And I felt like that was as good a way to be remembered as any.
Yes, I found you on Instagram, and I've been deep in the Magnolia soundtrack and really anything Amy Mann related, and was thinking about our overlapping tastes and realized, you know, you're working on this podcast, and I was listening to a bunch of episodes, and it got me really excited. I really love. I've looked for film podcasts to listen to while I edit. It's really, I find it really helpful. Keeps me motivated, you know.
Mm-hmm. Hey, listen. Whatever we can do to help people actually make things is always a good thing, because that's very cool. You're actually out there. You're making shit. You're doing things. I think that's terrific. So I said you're welcome to come on the pod. I sent you the list of films, and you picked out 2001: A Space Odyssey. So prior to this show, how familiar were you with 2001: A Space Odyssey? Before we get into the film itself, what's your relationship with 2001, and what's your relationship with Kubrick as a whole?
2001, it's really, I think it's the first movie I was shown when I was in high school that was with the tone of this is a serious movie, and movies are serious, and you're going to get something out of this that you might not get out of the movies you've been seeing up until this point. That was the sort of context. And now after rewatching it the last couple of weeks leading up to this episode, I have a different angle on it a little bit, or I feel a little, it's funny having seen it now, having watched a bunch of movies and thought a lot about movies and tried to make my own version of movies, you know, and then seeing it now, as opposed to seeing it when I may be 13 or 14 and being told this is the sort of grand artwork. So that's where I came to it from. And then in terms of Kubrick, I think, like everyone, that's just the sort of, or at least for me, it was like the first touch point in terms of an artist.
And Tom, with you, I mean, let's get into a little bit without having to get too into the weeds, because we've obviously talked Kubrick before on this show with Strangelove. When was your first time seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey? I know you've watched it a number of times, or should we say, given it the old college try a number of times in your specific case, and we won't get too into the weeds with that, but when was your first time seeing 2001?
First time must have been in high school, you know, getting more into just movies. You know, we were of the age where it wasn't as easy to see things. Just, you know, we didn't have streaming when we were in high school as we were getting into this stuff. So, you know, the old Netflix DVD service, may it rest in peace. I rented that. Must have been the Blu-ray. Maybe it was the DVD. Either way, I rented that, and like you so put it, I gave it the old college try. And this is kind of the thing with me and most, like at least half of Kubrick's movies, just doesn't connect to me. But even then, I understood its import, and even I've given it tries many times since then, and each time it just bounces off of me. But you just cannot honestly watch that movie and walk away from it and say, well, it was badly made and it was not important to the arc of cinema.
I mean,
well, I know someone could.
Someone did, and we'll talk about her later because I get very mad looking at that review, Pauline. But we'll get there.
So yeah, high school. Saw it another time after that. I gave it my fullest attention, my almost last ditch effort to try to give it the old college try when Alamo showed it on 70.
I was gonna say we saw that together, that one.
And then I watched it again, as prep over the weekend. Again, just it bounced off me. Whatever. But you this is something we'll get into. It's a movie that even if you don't like it, which I know is not a opinion you'll find throughout cinemadom, but even if you're of that opinion, you can't watch that movie and not come away with it going, well, I get why people love this movie and why it's important just in the arc of cinema.
I will say for me, and I'll get a little into this, weirdly in my head, in this weird kind of Proustian weird things connecting all together, 2001: A Space Odyssey and Led Zeppelin occupy the same space in my mind because of the fact that
tracks.
When you're when you're a little kid, you inherit opinions from your parents, right? Your parents will show you a thing or expose you to a thing and say, this is good. And so you go, yes, that's good. And then if you find out about something and they go, that's bad, that sucks, that's not good, you don't watch it because the people you trust told you it's not good, right? My dad, and my parents both, but my parents exposed me to a lot of classic films, classic music. I inherited the Beatles from them and the Rolling Stones and all of that on the music side. And film-wise, obviously, we watched a ton of movies when I was getting out. My love of the Universal monster movies, my love of a lot of classic sci-fi. In the same way that my father would talk about oh, I love the Beatles, really enjoy the Rolling Stones, hated Led Zeppelin. So up until I was maybe I don't know, let's say 11, 12, I was just well, I guess that band sucks because I listened to this person and they say it sucks. And the other thing is, if there is one movie that my father vehemently spoke of with disdain, it was 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's boring, it's overblown, it makes no sense. He would tell me this all the time. Now, his reasoning for thinking that and having that opinion, and he acknowledges look, beautiful film, important film, but his reasoning for that is that he went to see this movie in the theaters when he was a child, and we will get into this in the podcast, but this movie was horribly mismarketed, right? This is not a movie that should have kids' meals for it, but it did. So he hated it because it was this is not exciting for a child. When I was about 12 years old, I was starting to get really into movies, and I found the AFI list, and that had 2001 on it, so I was I should rent this. And it was around the same age I found my copy of Physical Graffiti that my uncle had left me, the Led Zeppelin album. And discovering both of those things are the first instances that I think we all have when we kind of approach teenagerhood of, oh, my parents told me this thing sucks, I think this rules. And, I got really into Zeppelin because of that, because I was how could you not like this? This rules. And 2001, and the first time I saw it was it's crazy to think now because it was a pan and scan VHS tape. And even then, I just remember coming away from that thing going, oh, this is one of the greatest things ever made. So it's Tom and I are not to say we're polar opposites, we're going to be fighting about this. We don't really argue about this movie much because we both acknowledge these are opinions to have. But whereas Tom says what bounces right off of him, I, even for my first time seeing this, I have held the opinion that this movie isn't just one of the greatest movies ever made, that it's just genuinely one of the great works of art, one of the true greatest achievements of man. And I've always felt that. So I've watched it a million times. I went to the Museum of the Moving Image exhibit that they had in Astoria last year with all the props. Got to see it in 70 millimeter there with my significant other, who had just watched it for the first time the night before and said she didn't care for it, which was fun. Because she was I don't really, because we basically...
So you brought her to the 70 millimeter print?
Well, what had happened was, because Museum of the Moving Image was screening 2001 in 70 millimeter in tandem with the exhibit, so you could get a ticket for both. I got that, but then realized the exhibit we actually had tickets to the exhibit before the movie. So it's like, well, you actually need to watch this before we go to the exhibit, because the exhibit's going to mean jack shit to you if you haven't seen the film. You're just going to walk in and see a giant baby and be like, why?
I thought you'd bookend it with the double screening.
And so she watched it the first time and went, whatever. And then we sat down for the movie, and we were like in like the front row for a 70 millimeter of 2001. And the minute also Sprach Zarathustra starts playing and we see the planets aligning, I'm thrilled. And she leans over to me and went, Jesus, are you crying? And it really was like just like a single tear down my face.
That's
awesome. Oh my God. Like, this is because I'd watched this movie so many times as a kid. I had the DVD, and then I had the Blu-ray, and I've watched it on a television so many times. And even Tom can speak. Let's talk about seeing it in 70 millimeter. Like, once you see it on film on a big screen, you do go, oh, this is how it was meant to be seen. Like, this is how,
Well, I mean, listen, I'm the jerk I'm a fucking, Ian can see my collection of movies behind me. And I'm a fucking completist. I think like as a library, and so I'm like, all right, well, I guess I gotta have all the Kubrick movies. Guess I have to have 2001 on 4K, and I'm gonna go against Mike on this one. This 4K Blu-ray, that's the way to watch it. You got a nice size TV and 4K setup. Good fucking God, does that movie look like it was made yesterday?
And I mean, that is true. That is we will get into the effects.
It is in particular a movie that's aged really well visually.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
is there a movie from this? I'll say at least from the 60s that has aged as well as 2001
really.
Visual effects wise? Because like there's movies from like a year ago that have aged worse than fucking 2001. I feel like
totally.
Shit, movies from 4 months ago have aged worse than 2000. Disney's entire ethos these days is, well, what if we made movies at 100 times the budget that Kubrick had, and hear me out, what if we made them look worse?
Totally. Totally. I was thinking a lot about when I was watching the Dawn of Man sequence like a week ago. I kept thinking of this movie Quest for Fire. Have you guys ever seen that movie?
Yeah.
From 1981.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's a movie with it's basically Dawn of Man, but the whole movie is cavemen, and it's all discovering fire, and it looks way worse than 2001 does.
Yeah.
And it came out about I think like 14 years later, 13 years later. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, that's kind of just like a discussion that is really prevalent these days, which is whether the studio wanted him to or not, Kubrick took the time to make sure the effects looked good. And we see that today. James Cameron spent 14 years making sure Avatar: The Way of Water looked good. And that is why there is a marked difference between the visuals of that movie, a very CGI-heavy, underwater-based movie, as compared to, say, a Black Panther Wakanda Forever, or, in theaters right now, The Little Mermaid remake, which is a movie everyone was clamoring for. Thank God they made sure they put the bird underwater and speak.
That's really interesting. I wonder if Kubrick would be doing stuff like that now if he was around. He'd probably be doing some sort of crazy incorporating CGI in some way, or going completely perfectionist OCD.
I feel like he would do what Nolan's done, which is go as practical as you can, but know that there is using CGI as a tool to enhance the effects. Because Interstellar still looks fucking great, and that movie is very visually indebted to what Kubrick was doing. Totally. So I feel like he would have that Nolan-esque, we got to be as practical as we can, but also it's just the state of the world where like we can make things a little easier with some CGI touches here and there.
No, I mean, listen, we know for a fact, had he been around today, Barry Lyndon would have been in 40x 3D. I mean, that we know.
Well, it would have been 120 frames per second. 120 frames per second, Barry Lyndon.
Yeah, good. So I can throw up in that theater too. I'll let Gemini.
Yeah, I do. I remember thinking, gee, I wish I could rip my eyeballs out. And then I look over and I'm like, where is Mike? Is he going to rip his eyeballs out? And he comes back. He goes, no, this movie made me want to throw up. And I'm like, the script? And he goes, no, the visuals.
We've talked about it on the pod before, so I won't get to it. But when we saw Gemini Man, we saw it in the high frame rate IMAX. And I think at one point I got up and walked away, and Tom thought, all right, Mike's got to take a piss. I came back shortly thereafter, got up and walked away again, and Tom was like, Jesus, dude, get it together. And by the fourth time, Tom was like, oh, something's wrong.
Because of the frame rate?
Yeah. That movie has certain moments. Because we saw it high frame rate, I think 3D IMAX. Like, at some
and that
point.
was only 48 frames per second, I
Yeah.
think.
It sounds sickening.
Truly, like, my head just stopped working at a certain point. But with 2001, have never gotten sick no matter how many times I've seen it. So, with that being said, before we get into more of what we have to say about 2001: A Space Odyssey, let's talk about what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry said about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick's landmark epic pushed the envelope of narrative and special effects to create an introspective look at technology and humanity. Arthur C. Clarke adapted his story The Sentinel for the screen version, and his Odyssey follows two astronauts, played by Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, on a voyage to Jupiter accompanied by HAL 9000, an unnervingly humanesque computer running the entire ship. With assistance from special effects expert Douglas Trumbull, Kubrick spent more than 2 years creating his vision of outer space. Despite some initial critical misgivings, 2001 became one of the most popular films of 1968. Billed as the ultimate trip, the film quickly caught on with a counterculture audience that embraced the contemplative experience that many older audiences found tedious and lacking substance. So, I do appreciate that their statement does get into kind of what the reception for this was. It should be noted, and we'll get into this more later, the ultimate trip is kind of a thing they add a bit later. Like I said, when the studio was first marketing this movie, they didn't really know what they had, which explains my father, and now I'll just bring this up because Tom has met him. My grandfather took my young father to go see this movie, and Tom, you've met my grandfather. Do you think he had any patience for whatever this nonsense was in 1960?
Oh, I think he was absolutely into it. I'm thinking it changed his life completely, and he dedicated his life to the furthering of marijuana laws being repealed.
Yeah, I think, spoilers, instead, he would just, for every decade after, look at my father randomly and go, the hell was with that baby? But, like, this was treated as an event. They had programs. But the other thing is, like, they had model kits of the ships, which my dad bought and built because, loved model kits at the time, just like Guillermo and Spielberg do now. And they had, like, kids menus at Howard Johnson's with, like, telling you, like, go see the next great space adventure. And it's not really what you got. And I think people were bummed with that. But there was this thing where, like, the youth kind of came to it. And it was interesting. I was listening to, I think it was Gary Lockwood on the commentary on the Blu-ray talking about, like, he would go out and promote this film. It was one of the two. It's Gary Lockwood and Keir Dullea are on the commentary. And I hate to be disrespectful to them. I can't always tell who's who when they're talking.
Well, it's hard to tell in the movie.
Yeah, exactly. But one of them was talking about, like, doing press for this movie and getting flack because he was talking about how much he loved this film and how important he thought this film was and how great it was. And the older press was, like, not liking it and saying he came off arrogant and all. So he went to the studios and he went, get me some college newspapers the next time we do this. Right? Like, get me some young people, some college newspapers. And he would do these press junkets with half college students and half older journalists. And what you saw was the college students were asking about the philosophical elements of the film or the scientific elements of the film. How do you achieve this velocity, this and that? And the older journalists looked like hacks because they were just sitting there going, have you ever met Doris Day? And he was like, that's when we kind of clued into, like, this movie is not going to work for the people who already have decided they know what a movie is. It's only going to work for the people who are looking for what the next kind of movie is. I mean, science fiction was not exactly, science fiction had its lane in cinema, but it was viewed as one particular kind of thing by an older batch of critics. And if you tried to do something different, they were not receptive to it, which is, I think a problem we still face now for a lot of films. But
it's interesting hearing you talk about the marketing too, because it sounds like they're trying to bill it like Star Wars before Star Wars was a thing.
Yeah.
And so once Star Wars happened, then they understood, oh, this is a thing. We can do something with this. But until then, and I guess this was around sort of old Hollywood, new Hollywood too, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the big year of, we'll get into it later when we talk Oscars, but, like, the year prior to this, 67 is, like, the year that breaks Hollywood, because that's Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Dr. Dolittle, all classics, all beloved. But this was, you're right. And they were also, science fiction was for kids, right? Like, until Stanley Kubrick decided to do this, like, there was two types of science fiction. Kids science fiction was at the movies. It was Flash Gordon, It was, if there was science fiction that adults liked, it was maybe The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was something that was like, it still was moralistic and it still was straightforward, or The Thing from Another World or anything like that.
Yeah,
And
Alien hadn't come out yet. They didn't have
No.
anything serious.
No, well, I mean, and then there was serious science fiction, but it was in magazines. It was in science fiction magazines. That's where Arthur C. Clarke comes from, things like that. Like, The Sentinel had been published in some science fiction magazine. In fact,
Right.
Keir Dullea talked about having read The Sentinel when he was younger, before getting the part in the film, and like when he was looking at the script going, oh, I know this. I know what this is. Even though this is The Sentinel is very different. The Sentinel is a thing that you look at, you read the short story and go, there's a kernel of an idea here that becomes 2001, but it's certainly not a one-to-one on that one.
I think
Which
it's
is,
interesting too. Oh yeah.
Kind of the thing Kubrick liked to do.
Yeah.
Hey, here's a story. I'm gonna do it not like this at all.
Well, and nobody really likes, like, The Sentinel is a thing where, and you see it with the Jack Kirby comics. I don't know, are you a Marvel Comics or comic book fan, Ian?
I know next to nothing, but I'm happy
Okay.
to learn.
So Jack Kirby is one of the great comic book writers, comic book artists, but also just a wild dude, right? He came up with the Eternals and Fourth World and all of this crazy science fiction stuff. He got to do a 2001 comic series for Marvel that started as like a straight adaptation, and then he just started making his own stories because he loved the idea of the monolith as alien intelligence, and they're wild and trippy as shit. They're incredible, but it seems like everybody, whether it's Kubrick or Kirby or whoever comes across it, who discovers Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel, kind of looks at that central idea of monolith is alien intelligence, and monolith on moon is like space burglar alarm or something. Looks at those ideas and goes, holy shit, that's really cool. I want to tell a story. And when Arthur C. Clarke goes, I've got a story to go around it, they go, no, not that. Not that. We're going to do our own thing, but I love the idea at the core.
Yeah, it's cool reading about how the movie was written, because if I was Arthur C. Clarke, you think he'd be kind of protective. I guess it's Stanley Kubrick, so of course you're going to want to work together. But I was reading about how the script for the whole movie came together from not just The Sentinel, but it was like 4 or 5 different short stories he wrote.
Yeah.
And all those ideas apparently were all involved. And I don't know, it's pretty righteous to accept that maybe the kernel is the best version of whatever idea you have,
And they were also, writing the book as they were writing the script. It was basically the idea of like, all right, well, basically make the novelization as we make the movie, so we can be a little more abstract and less obvious with what's going on in the movie, and the book will explain it because it's a book. You can do more explaining in a book and not lose the audience or whatever. So I think that's a very fascinating element of the creation as well. Even though they just they really just didn't know how to end this movie, like for the longest time.
Yeah.
Until they did like finally just come up with the baby and all of that.
And that is the thing that's fascinating that you discover with Kubrick all along, is I think like we love this popular idea of Stanley Kubrick, the ultimate control freak, right? Like that's the thing everybody likes to say. And it's not true at all. Like Matthew Modine has his book about the process of making his journal while he made Full Metal Jacket, and just casually drops like, oh, I'd have meetings with Stanley all the time, and I told Stanley to change the ending of the movie. And Keir Dullea has stories, and Gary Lockwood has stories of just like, Keir Dullea would just show up at Stanley's office. And he's like, I think this scene's bad. I want to change it. And Stanley, what do you want to change it to? We should go into the pod and he should read our lips. Okay. Like anybody telling stories about working with Stanley on these films that are allegedly like so hyper controlled, we're just like, oh yeah, he would say just come down and pitch ideas.
Yeah, hell, Lee Unkrich just came out with that book about The Shining, the making of The Shining, and it was all about. So he got so deep into the archives and everything and just disproving a lot of these myths about Kubrick, which is like, yeah, he shot a good amount of takes, more than the normal filmmaker you would, but it wasn't 80, 90, 100 takes or whatever to break the actor down. It's like, oh, he'd go to like 15 or 20 to get what he wanted. It wasn't this insane thing. So yeah, a lot of this Kubrick stuff is very, very much just a game of telephone at this point. That, like Man Shall Liberty Valance, print the legend, which
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think a lot of the mythos around him does. It makes sense when you watch the movies because his movies, all the performances are kind of not the same, but they're all kind of a little off and uncanny. And I feel like especially his later movies, like the last 5 movies he made, each one of them is kind of like sublimely beautiful and scary, and doesn't fully feel like it was made by a person. So it always kind of always locked into place for me the sort of narrative that, oh, he's like a crazy guy who pushes everyone he works with to the extreme. But I feel like everything I've read about him recently has been sort of exactly what you guys are saying, is sort of pushing against that old urban legend that he's really just sort of a Brooklyn artist who moved to London and was kind of eccentric
Yeah.
and extremely ambitious and kind of worked himself into the ground until he died, basically.
And I think a lot of that comes from, and it starts with 2001 because obviously, we covered Doctor Strangelove on the show in our first season, and you could definitely see elements of Strangelove in this movie. But this is where like the pure white, very sterile Kubrick style comes in.
Yeah.
And I think that part of why Kubrick gets that reputation, what Stanley Kubrick actually likes doing in his films is not giving you all the answers, is having ambiguity. And I think his purpose behind that is to leave enough blank space for your imagination and your kind of mind to consider the possibilities. And I think that the issue is Stanley's films are like mandalas. They're like things that you can stare at to meditate, and hopefully, if you stare long enough, it'll unlock something in your mind. And I think too many people go into his movies thinking of them as puzzles, thinking of them as something where he has left things,
Right.
equations that you have to solve, and that if you study all the details of The Shining long enough, you can win The Shining.
That's like the main one. That's the one that people get weirdly fucking crazy about, the puzzle pieces of just like, oh, well, this tomato can has Native Americans on it, so the movie's about the murdering of the Native Americans in America, and you go, what the fuck are you talking about?
But I think if you sat down with Stanley, and when he was in a good mood, if you sat down with Stanley and somebody went, here's what I see the Native American can in the background, and I think this is about the Native American genocide, he would go, yeah, I was thinking about that, and that's really interesting, but I don't think there's no like one-to-one, there's no puzzle to solve. 2001, I think why I found reading Arthur C. Clarke's book kind of so disappointing to me when I read it when I was like, I think I was like 14 or something, was the idea of realizing I don't actually want an answer. I talked about it a couple of weeks ago on our podcast when I mentioned Donnie Darko and how listening to Richard Kelly's commentary was one of the worst experiences of my life because that movie doesn't give you answers, and then you hear Richard Kelly's answers and go, oh, this sucks. 2001 and Kubrick's films in general, I think when people are looking for definitive answers, they come up with this idea of Kubrick like carefully laying everything out as opposed to like, what's going to trigger the best response? What's going to be an interesting visual that people can kind of take in one direction or another?
Right.
And if you listen to Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood talk about it, they say the same thing. Like, they were just
He wants to create an experience for the viewer that they sort of washes over them and they could process in like the months after viewing. And
yeah,
I think to accomplish that, there's a lot of subliminal stuff that goes on, a lot of real subconscious sort of color scheme, image shit that is really thoughtful, but not necessarily. Yeah, it's not. Well, I was thinking about that when I was watching because I was thinking about the way that movie had been presented to me, is that it was sort of something like that, like something to be pieced together.
Yeah.
Well, it's something we talked about before, how movies used to be able to just kind of be like, well, why'd you do that? Because it was cool. Or like, this didn't make sense. And you go, well, was it cool? Yeah, but it didn't make sense. Whatever.
What question did it make you ask,
Kubrick does that not in like messy filmmaking. Like there's filmmakers where like messy filmmaking is like, oh well, whatever, it was cool, we got away with it. He left that element to the text of the movie and what you're actually engaging with, the story. So like you said, like he's not giving you answers in this. He's not giving you answers in The Shining. He's not even giving you answers in Eyes Wide Shut or Full Metal Jacket. Really, he's letting it just be like, well, why'd you end The Shining with Jack in the picture? What are you trying to say there? And he goes, I don't know, I thought it was evocative. And it's just funny because I don't want to lose this point before we move on, but like you mentioned how like this almost feels like, I always say that David Lynch's first David Lynch movie was Blue Velvet, because Elephant Man, Dune, and Eraserhead, they all have things that he's always thematically been interested in, but like what we think of as David Lynch is not really there until Blue Velvet.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the same way I feel about this movie. This is the first of what we think of as a Kubrick movie, because Doctor Strangelove is great, Paths of Glory is great, Spartacus is great, all of that. But the super white not asymmetrical, symmetrical frames and all of that, that's all kind of like locked in right here. But it's funny because this was going to have an almost similar ending to Doctor Strangelove, where the baby blows up all the nukes hovering around the orbit.
That's in the
hovering
book.
Around the orbit.
That's how the book ends.
Kubrick was like, no, it's too much like Doctor Strange. We can't end it like that.
The book lays thick that like the U.S. and the Soviets have all these missiles floating in space. And the reason I'm glad they don't go with that ending, besides the fact that I hate it, is that...
Well, that's a good reason.
Yeah, well, the beautiful thing about the 2001 we get in the movie is that Earth doesn't matter, right? Like, as we don't know exactly what the relationship is between the U.S. and the Soviets, other than they can have a conversation, right?
And it's tense and weird.
Yeah, but it's not on the brink of war in a way. Like you can read into that if you want.
Well, it's almost more interesting.
Yeah.
The Russian guy's a freaky guy.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost more interesting it's not almost. It is more interesting not getting into that geopolitical stuff and kind of just having it where, like, yeah, it's a little tense, but it's almost tense in that it almost feels like a business conversation and not a political conversation. Sure. It almost feels like this is a future where all of that Cold War, space race bullshit doesn't exist. Like, we've gotten past that, and we're in space. We're mining the moon because we found a giant black Snickers bar dug up in the moon. And, like, it almost feels like politics is not a thing anymore, as, this movie's all about evolution and all that. We've evolved past this typical, political dick measuring nonsense. It is a lot more interesting to not even have any hints of that shit in there.
It's the fact that I think the vision of U.S.-Soviet relations in 2001 is kind of, I think, what we had as the vision of U.S.-Soviet relations in the 60s and 70s, which is this idea of, like, eventually we're going to figure out how to get along. Like, I don't think that there was necessarily... You don't really get this sense watching a lot of media from, like, the 70s, this thought of, like, well, within the next 10 years, that place will be gone. Like, that's not really... There was just this idea of, like, we'll learn to be copacetic. It's not... It doesn't feel like culture... In the movies, it doesn't really feel like there's this idea of, like, this is a war we can win until the Reagan years. Prior to that, it's, like, this idea of a stalemate and a, like, all right, maybe when, when these current leaders are dead, the next batch of leaders will be able to kind of just like shake hands and call it a day.
And it comes out in 68, but it takes them like 2 to 3 years to make it. So it's still, the positive 60s, even for a cynic like Kubrick, it even feels like would be thinking like, all right, well, this is not going to be the biggest problem for the longest time. We'll get over it. We'll talk to each other and
I mean, it's
and
not,
all of that.
Positive at this time so much as it's like there's a sense of there's kind of like a willingness into existence. Remember, his last film was about how we're going to blow each other up.
No, but that's what I mean. But that's what I mean. It's like the era of the time is still the Manson murders haven't happened yet. A rash of assassinations haven't happened yet. Where Nixon's not in office yet. Well, no, excuse me. Yeah, no, Nixon's not in office yet.
Not while they're making it.
When he comes out.
Yeah, because he gets elected in 68, and 68 is also one of the worst years for America for so many reasons.
That's why I'm saying, like, by the time this movie comes out, it's still like, hippie 60s, and even for a cynic like Kubrick, thinking about a movie in the future. Not, Dr. Strangelove is about the now, so he's cynical about the now, but even thinking of the future of like, all right, well, maybe these crazy kids, things will, they'll make the future a better place. And even if we need to evolve to space babies, like, this political shit's not going to be that much of a the Soviet thing, we'll figure it out. We figured shit out before. We'll probably figure this shit out at some point. So that's interesting for a cynic like him to not even want any sort of cynical readings of this movie. That this is, despite what a prominent dipshit critic says, that this is not a cynical, negative, warmongering movie.
Oh,
Yeah, I would say it's like his most upbeat ending or most positive ending that I could think of from a Kubrick movie, other than maybe
after
Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah,
Eyes Wide Shut, like one of the best last lines ever.
yeah.
Well, listen, everything would be better if we just fucked. Not us. I would never want to see this lump of shit naked,
unless you believe those cranks online who think the movie ends with the daughter getting kidnapped.
What?
I've seen it. Yeah, have you not seen this?
What are you talking about?
People talk about in the ending of Eyes Wide Shut. They believe that if you watch it, and I have not ever really looked for this, but they believe they see like two men that look like men you see earlier in the film taking Cruise and Kidman's daughter away in like the last scene, luring her
like
away.
In the very edge of the frame.
Yeah, in
the last 5 seconds of the movie.
God, people are so fucking stupid.
I mean, look,
God.
Here's what I'll say.
But I think Kubrick kind of invites that. He kind of invites you to like theorize about it and think too much about his movies because he's doing tons of weird shit like that.
My opinion I think Kubrick is the ultimate example of, and this is something Tom and I talked about. One day we were sitting back talking about movie podcasts and what we like in certain shows and we don't like in certain shows. And I was saying one of the things that I find so frustrating in a podcast, and when I'm talking about film, which is an art form that can be taken in so many different directions, something I find so frustrating when somebody will go, here's an interpretation I have of this film. Here's an angle at which I think you can look at this film and get something out of it. And then like somebody else will chime in and go, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's that. It's like, yeah, but the fun of this and the fun of cinema, and especially something like Kubrick, is that like you can sit back and you can go, yeah, but isn't it just like, to bring it to somebody that Tom and I were talking about recently, like, can you watch John Carpenter's you can watch John Carpenter's The Thing, go, it's really interesting to watch this from the perspective of the AIDS crisis. And then somebody could ask John Carpenter about that and he could say, I wasn't thinking about that at all. Like I didn't give a shit about that's cool, but I wasn't thinking of that. That doesn't mean don't think of the movie that way. It's more interesting to hear the different
it's just great storytelling. That's great storytelling, archetypal storytelling, really trimmed down, focused storytelling,
Just because this reminded me, I listened to it on a podcast, and I'm sure, Mike, you've heard this. Maybe you haven't, because it kind of surprised me. But do you know that there's a conspiracy theory going around about why Disney made the movie Frozen?
Yes, I've heard this, and it's nonsense in the same way that, like, to tie it all around, in the same way that, like, you listen to the commentary or read any book, Arthur C. Clarke, Keir Dullea, Gary Lockwood will all tell you, HAL is not IBM. Like, it's not about the one letter away. Like, I'm glad you found that. We weren't saying that. And with the Frozen thing, you were saying, it's
so funny because it gives such a level of like forethought to a company that clearly just is just stumbling around in the dark half the time, like most of these companies, but that they made the movie Frozen so when people would Google the words Disney Frozen, the Walt Disney Frozen head theory would not come up first.
That's awesome.
And the thing
is,
to be clear,
insanity.
It's cool that would be top of mind for Disney execs.
The company does not give a shit about that. And one of you remind me, when we get off mic, I have a story about that I can't tell on mic, but about just how little they give a shit about that rumor. But nevertheless,
and just before we get even deeper into discussing the movie itself, I just don't want to let this anecdote go. I told Mike I had an anecdote about Keir Dullea,
whose birthday it is today, by the way. It's his birthday as we're recording.
Happy birthday, Keir!
Happy 87th, boy.
It's looking good.
Hey, listen, everybody looks good when they're floating in the atmosphere.
Being in that alien zoo is pretty good for one's skin, I guess.
But it's a really quick thing, and I think I heard it on Joe Dante's podcast. But basically, at some like royal event where the Queen was there, I don't think it was like Keir was getting knighted or whatever, but it was just like a bunch of like artists were there, and one of them was Noel Coward, and Keir Dullea goes up to Noel Coward, extends his hand and says, "Hi, I'm Keir Delay," and Noel Coward, without hesitation, goes, "Gone tomorrow." And it's just like, wow, you just got fucking scorched. Just from the goddamn they nuked you like LV-246 in Aliens. He just left no residue of Keir Delay for anyone to even like tell that he existed on this planet ever again. Like, my God.
Yeah,
Why
we
would
can
you
build a
even
conversation from there.
Why would you even go up to Noel Coward? That's just like playing Russian roulette with your emotions. He will just stab you and walk away.
So we should get more into the film itself. I do want to talk a bit about up top. Because I had an interesting experience rewatching this. 'Cause I think I've seen this so many times that before I did my most recent rewatch, I almost said to myself, I don't need to watch it again because it's burned into my brain. And while that's true, I to some extent, like, there is this thing where, like, every time I watch it, there are just little details where I'm like, oh, that's a delight to experience again.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, that's, something new.
It is a joyful movie. If you watch it from the perspective of trying to discover new things, it's a deeply joyful viewing experience.
And the other thing that I have maintained with 2001 for a long time is it's funny. People
Totally.
don't think about how
I was
funny
really
it is.
surprised by that. All the little signs, like the little emergency ejection signs or the zero gravity toilet sign that are just dense blocks of text that you can't even read.
The zero gravity toilet shot is my argument against anybody who tries to say, like, Kubrick wasn't funny. Because, like, he follows Strangelove up with this, and people treat it like, oh, he just forgot how to have humor. Like, you don't there's no reason to include that other than it's a great joke. It's
just a great visual gag that immediately reads the second you see it.
Yeah, it's a funny movie. I mean, it's a dryly funny movie. Like, and you can also, I think that's the other thing, the briefing scene, right? Where what's his face? And I'm gonna go back to the prehistoric times in a second, but when Floyd is talking about the cover story,
about that.
Yeah. When Floyd is talking about the cover story in that big boardroom, like, people apparently were like talking about like getting bored during that scene, and I'm like, that's the gag. This is the closest to Doctor Strangelove that we're getting, that it's like, right, it's just kind of weirdly dull bureaucracy, right? That it's just kind of that even in a world where we have essentially discovered proof of alien life, it's still just a guy in a boardroom going, well, I know you don't like the story about us getting sick, but, we have to do what we have to do to maintain the cover. It's like, it's so bureaucratic. It's such nonsense.
Totally. And you also kind of, my experience watching this when I was in high school was that I would, or at least the first few times I saw it, was that I would sort of zone out. Like, especially in those scenes, I get generally what the gist of the scene is, that there's some weird tension. I couldn't really tell you exactly what the dialogue is covering.
Yeah.
Watching it this time, I sort of had this angle or this hat on the whole time where I kept thinking, okay, so these are the monkeys from the first scene. If these monkeys grew up to become these people, how am I then watching this scene thinking that, okay, these are just monkeys however many years later? And it kind of, I think from that perspective, it made a little more sense to me that it's so dull and that you're supposed to sort of space out a little bit, because you don't understand what the monkeys are saying when they're screaming at each other around the watering hole. But you're supposed to understand them just as animals, basically negotiating some sort of trade for information or power, and then loosely what they walk away with.
Exactly. And I think that, I mean, listen, Jack Kirby takes that literally in those 2001 comics. He does the 10-issue series or whatever it was. The first like 6 or 7 issues would start in the primeval age with this like cave person. Like, the first issue introduces like the Beast Killer, and the Beast Killer touches the monolith and learns how to make a spear. And then halfway through the comic, we jump to the year 2001, where it's like, this is the direct descendant of the Beast Killer. This astronaut,
and it's like a weapons manufacturer or something, or it would be an astronaut every time.
It's an astronaut who is then like every astronaut's journey is parallel to. So like Vera the she beast becomes an engineer and like these kind of things. But he does kind of just like draw this thing within the books, within comics. So I think you're absolutely right with that. I think that the prehistoric man stuff, because obviously like this film, you could technically say it exists in 4 acts if you want, which is the the monkey stuff, let's say, the Floyd stuff, the Hal stuff, and then the Stargate. But really, it's these
Sure.
3 points in time, in a way. The prehistoric stuff, the dawn of man, obviously off-parodied, one of these things that, like, everybody knows how to reference, to the point where, like, at this point, if you hear also Spook Zarathustra, you think of this movie, right? Like, you don't even... I cannot imagine anybody who thinks of Friedrich Nietzsche now when they hear also Spook Zarathustra, despite the fact that it was written to kind of be the music of Nietzsche's book, which also, I'm sorry, I don't get how that links up at all. I have read The Spook Zarathustra. I have listened to that song. I don't know how you get one from the other.
Nietzsche wished that he made movies. That's what he was trying to. They put music in movies. You don't got to put music for a book.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it is just weird. But so I think you see that. But even then, like, I think that the first couple times you see it, you're like, yeah, I get it. Monkeys and monkeys make tools. Monoliths is a tool. But every time since you kind of go through, like, it took me a while when I was younger, to pick up on the idea of it's not just about the monolith teaches them to make tools. It's the fact that the tool that he uses is a bone. And the idea is, like, the only way that these apes can evolve is through the death of another sentient life form, which ends up being the thing that pushes a Bowman through to the next stage of evolution, is defeating this other life form in Hal that is trying to fight for its own survival, right? So it's crucial that it be a bone. And the idea of, obviously, maybe the greatest match cut in movie history, tossing the bone up and it becoming the ship. I don't know if it's the greatest match cut in history. Lawrence of Arabia blowing out the match, we'll talk about later this season.
Well, that's my choice.
Could be the other one, but still,
also, not a ship. It's a nuclear arms station.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Oh, that rocks. Even more to the point of that.
Yeah.
More to the point of the bone, and then
like a couple shots later, we get the pen floating down the aisle of the spaceship, which I never clocked until this time. I was like, the pen is mightier than the sword, one might say.
Well, because the pen is the pen is the weapon of bureaucracy. The pen is what puts us in all these positions, right? Like,
you know what? I mean, I'm not trying to get too nerdy. This is, to me, where you could sort of draw the line between treating it like a puzzle or treating it as a sort of experience. But
yeah,
I was, even watching it this time, I was noticing so many different similarities that I think are just designed to kind of make it all feel like one big intentional story. But like when he's talking to the Russians and they're sitting around a table and he offers him a drink, I couldn't help but start to think, I was like, oh, is this supposed to evoke the watering hole in some way?
Mm-hmm.
Is that why there's like one little cup of liquid in the center that they're sharing, as opposed to everyone gets a drink?
Yeah. And that is ultimately, if there's a message to this, in a sense, it is kind of like, we need that little jump start to enter the next stage, right? That we need that little, and obviously, like, I will say
conflict.
And it takes on a different tone now, because, in the 60s and 70s, everybody was very big on this sort of chariot of the gods kind of theory, idea, whatever. This idea of, like, we're not alone in the universe, and maybe our society was kickstarted by aliens, right? Because that was fun to think about then. Now, in the 21st century, we've seen that idea. Maybe there are people who still subscribe to it. There's certainly people who still subscribe to it, but now we've kind of seen that the side effect of that thinking is a lot of reductive racism and a lot of weird cults. Wasn't really the issue at the time, like, at the time.
And Ridley Scott's Alien prequels.
Well, yeah, but at the time, like,
and nobody wants that.
But at the time, like, the idea of going, hey man, like, we're in the 60s. We've mostly gotten rid of God at this point. To evoke Nietzsche again, the God is dead idea, like, people were like, they didn't want to believe in, like, a religion, but they did want answers for how all of this happened. So just replace God with aliens. And the idea was, like, initially that was cool when the idea was, like, all of humanity came from aliens, but it very quickly became a way for, like, the descendants of race scientists to kind of go, how did all these non-white people build all these things? it must have been aliens. No, it just means that white Anglo-Saxons were not the only people capable of building shit. Like, or many different, religions and cults that have claimed, like, well, this alien dropped life on this earth, and that's why you should give me $50 and wear a tracksuit,
Totally. It's one of the funniest ideas about, or one of the most fun things to imagine, is that there was a period in the Middle Ages where, or any time in history, where like a bunch of gray men came down and gave us all the answers. But
Well, I think it's so much. It's so interesting though. Like, I know it's the God is dead era, but it's still the 1960s, and religion still has a big stranglehold on the country. I mean, I know the youth were getting into the God is dead stuff, but the fact that a movie that this just it's straight up just evolution's a thing. Like, yeah, we came from monkeys. This is not like we'll evolve into something else if we make it beyond this fucking stupid existence we've created for ourselves. But like, we're gonna evolve to something else. It's evolution.
yeah,
There's been court cases, I don't remember the exact date, if it was the 60s or whatever, but like, there were court cases about if you could teach evolution in schools.
Well, yeah, there was the Scopes Monkeys trial and things like that. But I think the difference here and why this film can hit, especially because Kubrick very wisely never shows us the aliens, is that I think that
Could be anything.
And the thing is, like, there is an outside force affecting man. And I think that when it comes to people getting freaked out about, again, the God is dead thing or anything like that, what freaks people out with that, and I think causes any of us to have kind of an existential crisis with that thought, is we all find a lot of comfort in thinking there's more than just us. We find a lot of comfort that there's some kind of purpose to it. And in a way, despite being a science fiction film, the existence of the monolith and the giant baby at the end and the existence of the aliens is spiritual. Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, it's cyclical.
And it's not the Christian God per se, but like, there is a powerful force that took somebody and went, I'm going to bring you to ostensibly heaven. That Bowman is in. It's not quite heaven, it's that weird kind of 17th century, like, Napoleon-esque room that he's brought to because that's what the aliens think humans live like, in their kind of.
Is that the explanation? Is that sort of the explanation in the book, or what Kubrick said in interviews?
It's both.
Like, it's an alien zoo.
Keir Dullea said that that's what Kubrick told him. The book gets into that too, and it's that.
I
kind
didn't know
of
that
thing.
until like very recently. It's so funny.
Well, funny enough, it's the same thing that happens in an old Star Trek episode. I don't remember the exact name of the episode. Tom, you know what I'm talking about. They're like, do you remember that one where they encounter that guy who is kind of like the proto-Q, and he's dressed in like 17th century garb because the last time he observed Earth was like the Napoleonic era. So like Kirk and Spock show up, and there he is in the costume, and he's got like the Napoleonic set, and he's just like, this is what you people do, right? Like, I looked at your planet, and this is how you people live. Now, really, they only did that because Desilu Studios was like, we got this Napoleon set. Can you do anything with this?
Really?
But it is a great dynamic, is the
That
idea
rocks.
of, like, if aliens... Now, I have heard different interpretations of whether it's, well, because of the way light travels, when these aliens were observing Earth, they were seeing this time period. Other people, like Keir Dullea, says it's because the aliens have this tech that can read his mind, but they don't really know what they're seeing. So they see this furniture and decor and just decide that must be how he lives, even though it's just a memory of a museum or something. That part's not entirely clear, and I don't know if it necessarily needs to be that clear, but I believe the human zoo thing is why you hear those weird noises, right? Because those weird noises that we keep hearing as he's going about his life are akin to what an animal in a zoo probably hears when human crowds are passing by.
Very scary to think about, and did not at all translate to me in every time I've seen it.
But at the same time, I don't know if I always find it terrifying, because I think in that yearning for spirituality way, like, there is something comforting about the idea of, I mean, like, to put it in terms, I talk about this sometimes with certain people, that, I'll talk to people sometimes, like when I was going in for my procedure and somebody told me like, oh, I hate hospitals. Like, I want to get out of hospitals as fast as possible. And I said, weirdly, I'm always very comfortable in a hospital. because my brain, when I'm hooked up to all the machines and I got all the wires and everything and all the monitors, my brain can finally relax because it goes, somebody else is in control. Like, there are people all around me. If a thing beeps, if a whatever goes, like, that's in somebody else's hands now. And I do think that one of the elements of the human zoo aspect, and one of the elements of the alien side of things that is a spiritual part of this movie, is the idea of talking about Kubrick as an optimist rather than a pessimist, right? I do think there is that element of, like, yes, you could find the idea of aliens plucking one of us out and putting us in a human zoo to be terrifying. And that's not a wrong way to read that. But at the same time, there is this idea of, like, rather than just being launched into the cold emptiness of space, like, the best that we humans have achieved is creating a computer program that will launch a man into the cold depth of space. These aliens have found, like, we're going to give you a comfortable spot to live out the rest of your days. And, like, compared to being in a yellow spacesuit and floating out until you die, and if you read the third Arthur C. Clarke book, 3001, being found 1,000 years later, right?
Awful.
That's that's it's a little different. It's a little better. So
I'm just still hung up on the fact that Mike Natale lives on Long Island, has probably met many a nurse that works as nurses, and still feels comfortable having those people taking his life in their hands. I was never comfortable in hospitals. Now that I've grown up and met and drank and hung out with many a nurse and people in the medical field, I am even less comfortable with hospitals.
Yeah, are you a masochist, Mike?
No, it's, you know what it is? I want to be clear. It is not that I necessarily super trust the people working in the hospitals. It's just the fact that I trust them more than myself. It's that I have set the bar so low for being able to take care of myself and survive on my own that I'm like, surely someone else can do a better job than what I've done with this.
So the alien zoo sounds kind of appealing to you.
Yeah. No, but, like, it's honestly, like, I do think there's this, it's open to a lot of things. There is this idea of the aliens providing guidance, I mean, the whole idea of the monolith on the moon, that comes from the Sentinel, is the idea of that the aliens essentially gave us two monoliths. One was on Earth that gave these apes the tools, and the other monolith is on the moon with the idea of, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going to give you intelligence enough to make weapons, like to make a tool, and then we're going to leave this second one here as a little alarm for us. And if you guys are ever able to make it to the moon and find this second monolith, it's going to set off an alarm and let us know, okay, these guys are ready for the next stage. Which is, in its own way, a kind of a, people could find it terrifying, but there is an element of, like, there is somebody taking care of us, there is somebody watching over us, there is somebody overseeing us. And Tom, I agree with you that, like, religion still exists in the 60s for sure, as it still exists now. But I do think the 60s, 50s, 60s is a pivotal time where, like, science has done so much that we now know we can split the atom. The possibilities can be seen as scary more than just optimistic. And I think that the fact that 2001, unlike other science fiction, which is either entirely dystopian pessimistic or entirely, utopian vision of the future, that 2001 manages to straddle a line where whatever your feelings are at the time, you can see this movie as either optimistic or pessimistic, and it never really strays from believability. I mean, nowadays we can sit back and go, this couldn't happen because Pan Am doesn't exist. But you can see how in 68 somebody was watching it and was like,
Yes,
oh yeah, all of this is real.
That is the big hang-up. The branding of Pan Am.
No, but I mean,
know what you mean. I know what you mean. It's more speculative sci-fi than, like, this what we think of as sci-fi. This is very much of a forward-thinking movie where it's about, well, where can we go? Let's read the tea leaves. What's possible? And with the philosophical ideas at play, let's mix those together and make those feel real. Which again is that whole kind of stripping the narrative away to its barest minimums to kind of just leave it as, well, we're never going to show the aliens. The furthest you will get is the space baby, and that's not even really like the aliens. It's just, well, this is the next step Dave takes. He's not God. He's not an alien. He's just transcended, and he's now a new form, a baby in the cosmos, all of that stuff. So it all feels very much kind of like what Kubrick always did, ground everything. It's a very imaginative movie. Again, go fuck yourself, Pauline. But
What did Pauline say?
Oh my God, Pauline
What's
Kael.
her damage?
She wrote
She's always in a bad mood.
She wrote a scathing review of 2001. I only pulled one quote from it in my notes, but I have the whole thing written out somewhere. But she starts the review. The new tribalism in the age of the media is not necessarily the enemy of commercialism. It is a direct outgrowth of commercialism and its ally, perhaps even its instrument. If a movie has enough clout, reviewers and columnists who were bored are likely to give it another chance, until on second or third viewing, they discover that it affects them viscerally. And a big, expensive movie is likely to do just that. That's how she starts. So her premise she operates on.
She was anti-clout.
Well, the premise she operates on 2001 is a premise that we see a lot of like film Twitter people get on now, which is not just to go, this didn't work for me, but it's to go, this movie is boring, and anybody who says it's not is pretending.
This movie is a symptom of a larger problem within the film industry.
And saying like, well, people are just pretending to like it. And her review goes on to say that the movie is painfully unimaginative, which is an insane criticism level against this, and also says that the movie is pro-war and pro-weaponry. It is like a 4-page review that she wrote, and it is just taken this movie behind the woodshed. And it's not the only one. There were other reviews that came out later where like critics ripped it and then later went like, actually, we're sorry, we misunderstood it.
My understanding of isn't Pauline's whole deal that she would only ever watch a movie once, and the way that it presented itself to her the first time, no matter what mood she was in when she saw it or how she felt about it, that's her review, and she'll never watch it again. And that does seem sort of fundamentally against what the kinds of movies that Kubrick makes or is interested in making.
I mean, I think the thing is with Kael, right? I think that Pauline Kael, and it happens later with Roger Ebert, and I think it's now the culture we exist in now largely, where Pauline Kael was interesting and where Pauline Kael appears in like most people's or should appear in most people's development as a film fan is that she would have she was an excellent writer, right? Opinions aside, like she could, if she wanted to drag something, she could drag it better than anybody. She could come up with great analogies. I think at one point she talks about 2001 and she says, because she talks about people going to see 2001 to get a vibe, right? To get an experience. And she goes, you know,
hell yeah.
To have a, like, basically she calls it out. She's like, people are going there to feel like they're getting high. And she goes, going to 2001 A Space Odyssey to get that experience is like going to a Rock Hudson Doris Day movie and saying you liked it because it gave you great design pointers. Which is, I don't agree with the opinion, but it's such a great dig that you can see how people read that and are like, yeah, fuck this, even though it's off base. And I think that with Kael, like, you can read Kael's reviews, and as you should with pretty much most art criticism, you should go, huh, that's an interesting angle to look at this at. I'm going to take some things from this. If I agree with it, it kind of changes my perspective a bit. What it shouldn't be, and what happens with Kael, and I think now happens with Roger Ebert a ton, is somebody going, well, that's what they said, and they're an expert, so I'm going to adopt their opinion as my own. And, you know, I think that's the Kael problem, you know, through and through, and especially with something like this.
To me, the Roger Ebert spirit, the ideal spirit with which you express any opinion about a movie is that you'll fight to the death about how you feel about it and what your experience is, but you would never presume what anyone else's experience is. I love watching Ebert and Roper go at each other's throats, but only because I feel like I'm learning something. It wouldn't be as fun, I think, if they didn't want to hear what each other had to say. If that makes sense.
My ultimate opinion on Pauline Kael is, again, back to Joe Dante's podcast and a sentiment he put forth, which is that he either read David Lean's biography or talked to David Lean or something where Pauline Kael dragged David Lean to hell and back for Ryan's daughter, and David Lean took it so hard that he essentially retired. He would make a passage to India like 10 years later, but he basically gave up because he took it so personally that he was just like, well, I guess
Come on,
I just shouldn't
David.
make movies. But as Joe Dante put it, he goes, is the world a better place with another Pauline Kael review or with another David Lean movie? And
Damn
I
right.
believe it's a David Lean movie, and I agree with Joe Dante. I think she was an asshole. Now you can make notes, Kyle.
Isn't that the whole industry that you get
I do think
reviewed, your ass kicked, and then you got to get back up and.
But she would do it in such a personal way where it wouldn't be just you made a bad movie. It's that you were a bad person and you were inept as a filmmaker and you shouldn't be allowed to make movie. Like, she was personally vicious, and it's a thing that I think, like Mike says, we see a lot today, which is just, we're not just talking about the movies now. We have to take down the people that made the movie. So if we don't like a movie now, well, it's because it's morally incorrect. It's not how we view the world, so it's bad. And you go, all right, well, number one, I don't think that's what the movie's saying, this immoral stance you think it's taking, but also, who fucking cares? That doesn't mean they believe it.
And the other thing is with that, and I think when it comes to film criticism in general, and especially now, it's, to evoke Man Who Shot Liberty Valance again, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. People in the critical position, it's never to suggest we should be bashing critics or anything like that, but we do have to remember they have the ability to print the legend. I will talk to people my parents' age about movies from the 70s, 80s that have been reclaimed. Like right now, if you talk to anybody under the age of 40 about John Carpenter's The Thing, they will tell you that's a masterpiece. But if you talk to somebody who was alive when that movie most people who were alive when that movie came out and got savaged in the reviews, and you go, John Carpenter's The Thing, they'll go, isn't that a bad movie? Because the reviews then, that's it. The legend has been printed for them. And even in our lifetime, like, you see it with, for whatever reason, I'm not saying this film guy's a good filmmaker, bad filmmaker, whatever. For a decade, Michael Bay was a punchline.
Right,
even
and now he's kind of cool to like.
Yeah.
Now people are kind of into him.
But even people who didn't watch his movies knew, like, oh, explosion, all this. How many people are fucking doing, AI Wes Anderson? That has nothing to do with Wes Anderson. But it's because we've created, like, a certain cliche or a certain stereotype. We're talking about it with Kubrick and the myth around him. It happens constantly, and the critics and the critical consensus are the ones that can shape that. And that's why the best critics are the ones who can help you see a new side of something or help you appreciate art better. I mean, I'm not talking about us in any highway, but like the reason we're doing this show the way we're doing it, and we set out from the beginning, Tom and I, with the idea of like, we were very sick of how many movie podcasts are out there that were interested in like deconstructing the canon. That has a place in culture. It absolutely does. But now it feels like there's such an overwhelming desire to deconstruct the canon that now, if you watch a supposedly classic, if you watch a Citizen Kane or a Casablanca as a younger person, and you're like, I don't get it, and you try and search it, you're going to find a million essays telling you why everybody's wrong because it's actually bad, before you find anything actually arguing the merits of the work. So for us, the idea of this show that we went into was the idea of the Library of Congress picked this movie and said it was important. Now we can come into this conversation and have our own reasons for why this movie has value. Yeah. But the one thing we're not going to do is come into the conversation and go, they were wrong, it has no value. And I think Kael going into 2001 and going, all of these other people are saying they like it, and I didn't like it, and that must mean they're all dumb and liars. That, to me, is the worst way to go into not just a film.
I know you're right on paper. I know you're absolutely right, and I 100% agree with everything you just said, but hearing... I can so relate to the feeling of going to a thing that's been so hyped up and sitting in the audience and watching the whole thing and thinking, fuck this. Listen, fuck everyone that likes this shit.
I do it. We've all done it. But I do think that the issue comes out of the idea, and this is where this Kael review is such a problem to me. The issue comes out of, I don't think it's wrong to not like something that everybody else likes, but I do think it's wrong to be incurious about why other people like it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the biggest problem. I don't like this movie, but I'm not running around fucking besmirching everyone else that does and saying, well, they're idiots, they're clout
Right.
chasers, they're just doing what everyone's told them for 60 years. I'm like, no, I just bounces off of me. I get the philosophical stuff, I get the narrative stuff, all the stuff that's on the edges of everything, what it's trying to say. I get it. I don't like it. But like I said at the beginning of this episode, I am not self-involved and narcissistic enough to have that opinion and still say, well, it's not important. No, fuck that. That's ridiculous. And if you're a critic, you have to have higher standards than fucking the three jerk-offs on this podcast talking right now. I go into plenty of shit where
Why are you
everyone...
going to say that about our guest? He can
Hey,
do
listen,
that to
I'm
us.
happy
You
to be
can't-
included.
Because he accepted to be on this show. He's obviously got something wrong with him.
Totally. And I know every film podcast you guys have referenced is one that I already listened to.
I haven't
it is
said any by name.
I haven't said any by name, but so many.
We'll do that
are just...
off mic, but I'm not doing it on.
But it is like so many shows. I said it when I was recording High and Low with Robert yesterday, but like so many shows nowadays are all about bits and trying to outsmart the movie and not really get into why a movie's good. It's all about beating the movie and showing how you're better than the movie. I'm like, I don't think that's really interesting. There's maybe one or two podcasts that can do that, and even then, sometimes they get a little bit up their own asses, but it's like, there's a reason why 2001 is beloved, you know? There's a reason why it's in the National Film Registry in its 3rd year.
Yeah.
You know, this is like, all right, well, we got through 50 movies, so we're getting another 25. What has to be in the first 100, the first 75 movies inducted here? 2001's got to be one of them. Just because I don't fucking like the thing doesn't mean I can say, well, everybody's wrong. It's like, no, everybody's got their own fucking opinion.
Yeah, and sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm just rambling at this point, as per usual.
All I was going to say was just that in response to what you guys said about the way that this sort of the Western canon of film is discussed and criticized, I think probably a big part of that too is just that even though these movies are all technically accessible, they're also not really presented to you in any way that is particularly appealing or exciting. A lot of these classic movies that I happened to watch in high school, I saw on TV. Like I saw the original Night of the Living Dead on TV because it was playing around Halloween. I probably wouldn't have seen it otherwise. I saw Citizen Kane or 2001 on TV. And even now, it's like even that wasn't the ideal way to see them. The ideal way would be at a movie theater, which is even less common now. So I'm a big advocate for making these movies seem as appealing as possible for people to watch and formulate their own opinion about whether they think it's trash or not. I've never watched Citizen Kane all the way through and stayed awake. That is the one movie I have watched that movie 4 or 5 times and have nodded off. Maybe it was just the context or the circumstance of the movie almost every time I've seen it.
Well, when I was in high school, my senior year of high school, well, we went to the same school, so I don't know if you had this too, but I was in humanities senior year, and there was a film component. And a couple years later, Tom and I actually went back and guest taught a class in that class, which was a very surreal experience. But
Awesome.
Oh my God, we did, yeah.
We did, yeah. And after we did the class, one of the students saw us in a hall, ran up to Tom and I, and said I just want you to know that was my favorite class I've ever been in. And we were riding high on that for the rest of the day. But in my film class, I was a big film nut, and nobody else in the class was. And the teacher was not really interested in teaching a film class, right? She was a history teacher who just got stuck doing film. I remember getting so fucking mad because she goes, "We're about to watch Citizen Kane. It's black and white. It's kind of old. A lot of people say it's the greatest movie ever made. Honestly, I don't really get it." And then she hit play. And I got fucking furious because I'm like, you can't start that way. You cannot invite people to not like something. People cannot like it, but you can't set them up and go, this is dog shit.
Yeah, because of course they're going to hate it. Yeah. No one's going to like a movie when it's set up that way.
Yeah, and that's kind of, to get us back, and we'll do, before we wind down, we'll run through the plot of 2001, because I'm sure we have little things we want to hit, but something like a 2001 A Space Odyssey, if you treat it like a chore the first time you watch it, if you treat it like a chore going in, it is a chore. This is not a movie that goes out of its way to convince you to engage with it. It is a slow movie. It intentionally so. It is a tranquil movie intentionally so.
It starts with 3 minutes of music with no imagery.
Yeah.
Which was like I completely forgot. And then when I was watching last week, I actually went to my friend Alex, is the DVD broken? Because I didn't. I thought maybe that we weren't getting image.
It's a cosmic overture, right? Like it's, if you're not, I mean, we dealt with this earlier this season with I think with a movie called Gigi. I don't know if you've ever seen Vincente Minnelli's Gigi. It's that movie is very, very easy now to decide you don't like it right away, right? And if you do that, you're out. When I first saw Gigi when I was 13, I was like, this movie sucks. And to be honest, like if you sat down and watched Gigi now and you sit through the opening number, which is called Thank Heaven for Little Girls, you're going to probably feel an impulse to go, oh, I'm out. Tap the button, hit the stop button, because just hearing that
They don't make them like that anymore.
Well, but then you dig into the movie and you watch it and you realize like, oh, that song is actually about this old man who used to be quite a Lothario back in his day, and in France during the Belle Epoque, the last times of like carefree France, essentially going like, young love is incredible, right? Thank heaven for little girls because little girls get bigger every day and all of that, right? And the argument is, and because when you watch the movie as a whole, the movie is all about like French society going, young girls become mistresses who become wives who become old. And Gigi kind of bucking that trend. But if you're not going in with the idea of like, oh, maybe this song means something, and you immediately hear it and go, them pirates in 1958, like, okay, well, you're not going to get anything out of this movie. If you're already like, it's another movie that just does, but again, we watched it for the show, and listen, I got to tell you, I was not anticipating Tom coming away from Gigi and going, good movie. But we got, it happened because you go in with an open mind and you're willing to engage with a movie and like...
Well, and it's just also like a personal philosophy of mine, which is just the vast majority of movies are good. Like at a base level, every movie most movies are kind of like, at worst, good. Where you're like,
it's a miracle that a single movie's made.
Yeah, and it's like most movies where you're like, all right, not mad I watched that. That was solid, pretty good. Watched it at the movies on a Friday night, had a good time. And yeah, you may never think about it again, and it doesn't fucking become a part of the canon. But you watch and you go, that was good. Yeah, had a good time. I think most people need to adopt that mindset, which is just there's so much. Not just made today, but made over the 100+ years of cinema. That so many movies in each genre, movies from other countries. There's just so much where if you just think you're better than it, yeah, you're not going to like most things you see and you're going to think, oh, it's bad. No, most movies are working at a base level of good. That doesn't mean every movie's good, obviously. I just watched Superman Returns. Dog shit movie. Everyone involved should be ashamed. 2 of them really should be ashamed. But it's a bad movie. But like,
doesn't that ever make you angry, though? When you see something that's really bad, not that it shouldn't exist or that there should be less movies in general, but just you see something that's so bad and so against anything that you stand for or believe in or your values around art making or the world. Does it ever put you in the state of mind where you're like,
blockbusters do. When a movie that costs $200 to $300 million is bad, I get annoyed because that is too much money to be throwing away without any sort of quality control, and you're just churning out content. I've seen plenty of dog shit movies that are like $500,000, $1 million, whatever. Plenty of terrible horror movies that are cheap. But I don't get fucking offended by them because I'm like, all right, they took a shot, whatever. They didn't have a lot of resources. Shit doesn't work out sometimes.
Right. I often feel that way more about that. Yeah.
But like when you go and see fucking like Ant-Man Quantumania and you're like, Jesus Christ, the amount of fucking money that got spent on this thing. How do you even allow a movie like that to come out? Well, like I said before, watch Superman Returns. How do you spend like 4 years pre-production, post-production, all of this shit?
It's funny.
How do you let this happen?
I feel that way about those kinds of movies, but then more so the types of movies that I see that I feel that way about are often lower budget independent films where it felt as though the people, it's all relative, right? Because actually, like, you're right, 500 grand is really nothing for a movie, or like even 100 grand or 10 grand or whatever. But I see plenty of movies that are made for like maybe 50 grand or 100 grand, and I get similarly angry or upset, I think, because it feels like often in those circumstances, even more so than in blockbuster films, people are given opportunities like no one's getting those opportunities to make an indie film. And there are people that bust their asses and don't have a rich benefactor or a special connection that brings them to this place. And then I think, oh, you're actually making it, when you are given that opportunity and don't make something good out of it, you're actually making those opportunities hard to come by for all the people who are trying really hard or who do deserve it for whatever reason.
Well, I think it's also a thing of whether it's a big budget, like it's just so rare. I think, and this will bring us back to what we're talking about. It's so rare that you get a film that feels so singular in its vision, right, and so deliberate in its design that whether or not you actually think the film is, and I know people got mad at 2001 when it came out and went, "What the hell was this?" But it's impossible to come away from 2001 and not feel like you got something out of it, right? And not feel like there was
It's a full meal.
that there was some kind of enrichment to it. And for me, in terms of films I get mad at, the only times I get mad at a film is when I come away feeling like nobody cared, right?
I think that's sort of what I'm describing. Yeah.
I will
Or a movie made on autopilot.
Autopilot. Here's the weird thing: autopilot doesn't bother me as much. Like if I'm watching a by the book blockbuster and it's bad, I just kind of go, "All right, too many cooks in the kitchen. It was following a formula." Where I get madder is when you can feel that there should have been and was supposed to be a steady hand on the wheel that had an opportunity to do something and
Right.
didn't give a shit. And again, we're going to get back to 2001, but like,
Totally.
for all of my problems, I don't find Taika Waititi that interesting as a filmmaker, right? I don't. But for all of my problems, I look at something like whether it's Thor Ragnarok or Jojo Rabbit or whatever, and I'm like, I don't like his shtick, but effort went into this, right? Like a guy had an opportunity and he made his thing his way. And then I go see Thor Love and Thunder, and the entire time is just pervaded with the feeling of, you didn't care. So if you don't care, why should I care? And I think that with Kubrick, like we talked about early on with the mysteries in his films, the reason why it attracts so many people trying to solve the puzzle, and the reason why it gains the kind of the reputation that it has, is that when you watch 2001 or any of his other films, but especially 2001, you feel how much he cared. And I think people get enticed to solve the mystery of 2001, that there isn't really a mystery. They get enticed to solve the mystery of 2001 because everything in this movie is so deliberate that you can't help but feel like he has the answer, right? Like you can't help but feel like, that in the same way that to evoke a film that an indie film that of another person who is deeply, deeply canceled, but like in the 2000s when if you went to like IFC and saw this movie everybody's talking about called Primer, you walked out and you're like, I don't know what the fuck happened in that, but I know the guy who made it knows what happened in that.
Totally.
And that's like, that maybe is one of the coolest feelings you can get when seeing a movie, is the idea of like, I don't know what all of that meant, but I know the guy who made it knows what that meant, and that's cool.
I felt like that during the Suspiria remake.
Yeah.
That's an amazing
Suspiria.
feeling.
I mean, that's the appeal of Christopher Nolan for a lot of people, right? Is that like, you don't need to understand what the plot of Tenet is. You're like, he's got it figured out. I'm just going to take the ride, right?
Yeah.
I'm just going to vibe.
I'm the protagonist.
So let's, if I may, for our last little chunk, because we've run on, but I want to just kind of hit the four major movements of 2001 and just kind of get some scattershot thoughts before we evolve into giant space babies. Does that work for everybody? So
sounds great.
Let's start with the Dawn of Man. The Dawn of Man sequence. Most of my notes are just me saying, God, this looks so fucking good. And I already said the thing about this. But one of my favorite things in this sequence is that for a number of years, I thought the monolith was superimposed. Somehow, Stanley managed to do this thing where the monolith is painted in such a way that even though I'm watching the apes touch it and everything, it looks like it's added in later.
It looks fake, right?
Yeah,
It looks
does.
fake.
It looks fake.
I was watching it the other day, and I'm like, I know it's not. Somehow it looks like a CGI creation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such
Yeah.
a cool visual trick.
Yeah, I noticed this a lot in the last couple of times I watched it for this show. Where so many of the special effects in the front screen projection look so good. Like I really think it looks pretty convincing. Even when it kind of looks a little like Museum of Natural History tableau, it's still like very beautiful and intentional. There are also moments where I think he does kind of lean into the limits of his special effects and kind of makes them graphically like pleasing or interesting, or aesthetically interesting, but not for the sake of realism, for the sake of trying to make an interesting choice. Like there's like that, the fact that like the monolith doesn't look that real, the fact that you see the panther's eyes, which was apparently I read was caused by the front screen projection. Literally, it lit the panther's eyes, and they kept it because it looks kind of surreal and crazy. Stuff like that feels really. It's like he's kind of a graphic designer, you know. He's got his eye on the font choice and everything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just for how much he takes pains to make this shit look good. He said it would take one person 13 years to hand draw and paint all the mats needed for the backgrounds. So he just hired 12 people to do them, and it cut the time down to 1 year. So he was thinking economically.
Yeah,
let's cut it down a little bit. 13 years even for me might be a lot, but let's bring it down to a year. So 12 people.
We should say in terms of like the score, whether it's at the beginning or not, there is something about the use of the classical music in after the bone gets launched, all that. I'm only saying it because like I think one of the problems that maybe we run into sometimes doing this show is we're so deeply enmeshed in like film talk that sometimes we forget that certain things aren't common knowledge. We should acknowledge there was a score composed for this movie.
Multiple,
for all of these sequences.
right?
Yeah. And Kubrick was just using classical music as a temp track to cut to, and then looked at it with Blue Danube and also struck Zarathustra and was like, oh, this works better. I'm just going with this.
He made the mistake that every filmmaker makes when they use temp music.
Yep.
That they want to just use the temp music. And then it ended up changing the course of film history.
Yep, absolutely.
In the 20th century.
Oh, yeah. You could tell there's a lot of movies made in the last 30 years that tempt with John Williams music. And
totally, or Hans Zimmer.
Music. Yeah. Oh, Hans Zimmer. Actually, Hans Zimmer might be the worst because you're just like, what did you just watch fucking The Dark Knight Rises last week? Like, come on.
When you're watching a movie where Arvo Part was used in the temp track because you got that squeaky violin, that minimalist violin.
Listen, Mike knows me for a long time. So, Mike, do you think that this was my favorite segment of the movie?
I mean, as we discussed on an episode that we've recorded already but comes out later, if there's a monkey throwing fists, you're on board.
And that monkey doesn't just throw fists. You know where that monkey takes the other monkey? To the bone zone.
I thought you were going to say it gives him the business, which was your.
Well, he gave him the business in the bone zone.
For a solid 2 years, you used the phrase "take him out back and give him the business" ad nauseum. There was
It's highly evocative.
Years.
Take him out back and give him the business. It's good. I should bring it back. We used to be a country.
Any other thoughts on Dawn of Man, or are we moving on to Haywood Floyd?
It's crazy that this it took so long to make, but that it came out the same year as Planet of the Apes.
Yep. That's the thing. This is
wild.
This was a banner year for sci-fi in terms of like, there's not a ton of incredible sci-fi films. Like, I'm not gonna ride here for like Astro Zombies, but
well, that's your fucking problem.
John Carradine and Astro Zombies.
Fever.
Well, because this year, 1968, you get 2001, Planet of the Apes, Barbarella, and then over in Japan, you get Destroy All Monsters, like the ultimate kaiju movie. And like between those four films, you're just like, well, we ate good this year. Like the only year I would argue is maybe better for sci-fi is 1982, where you get like The Thing and E.T. and Blade Runner and all of that. But
yeah, people have been wanting to see monkeys in a movie, and they finally got what they wished.
Monkeys were in.
I also think 2001 and Planet of the Apes provide a great parallel to one another in terms of like, one is very, very abstract, very, very cerebral, and very much about like me and Arthur C. Clarke are trying to figure out what the future actually looks like, right? And going to great
Right.
lengths to try and predict the future, right? It's sci-fi's prediction. And Planet of the Apes, which I also love, but Planet of the Apes takes the opposite approach, and we're like, it's about allegory first, right?
Yeah, it's a parable.
It's about science fiction to teach a lesson, and it's about science fiction reflecting who we are now and to make us think outside the box, right?
And oh no, the Statue of Liberty's coming to get me.
Yeah.
I may be drunk when I saw the end of that movie. That I don't know.
I know you want to move on to the next segment, but
I don't know. What do you have to say?
I do. There were just a couple of things that the Dawn and Man sequence of all this. That's just my favorite thing.
Mhm.
I could have watched that for an hour and a half of just the monkeys basically discovering.
Well, you told us
you
you told us you did, and you didn't like it.
I did. Quest for Fire. I mean, I think everyone don't listen to this
Not
podcast and think you shouldn't see Quest for Fire. Everyone should see Quest for Fire and form their own opinion on it. Watching Quest for Fire, I did have the overwhelming sensation. Oh, it just made me want to make Quest for Fire.
Well, and
or do my own version of it.
Quest for Fire also has the Star Wars holiday special problem of, so no one's talking? We have a long stretch where it's just noises?
They're not
I'm
even
not
gonna,
sure
yeah.
this is going to fly?
They're not even have like a caveman language that I can hold on to. No,
Captions that we're just rolling with it? All right.
It's all clowning. Yeah. I will say, one thing I noticed between Quest for Fire and the Dawn and Man sequence is that, okay, so you're getting all these shots of the beautiful, crazy alien landscape, the Sahara, the sun rising just over the horizon, which I found out those are all still photos.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was all film. That's still. That's why it feels so eerie. You're like, what's going on? Why does it feel so? So then apparently, the first time they show the monkeys, they're in shadow. Or I was just thinking that if they showed the monkeys right off the bat, you immediately see that they're a bunch of LA dancers in like funny costumes,
Yeah.
or acrobats that they got from New York. When you see them, they're partially obscured. They're just silhouetted in the shadow of the rocks with this giant landscape behind them. And then you're introduced to them. And you're never introduced to an individual first. You're introduced to the group. And then you slowly zoom in on an individual where you get the panther attack on one of them. And then later you get the other one that discovers the bone. That kind of sort of zooming out from big picture to small picture answered a lot of questions for me in terms of how do you get people to care about or connect to like a caveman or a hominid or something that's sort of a more primitive version of us in a way that I think was more successful than Quest for Fire or other movies I've tried to see do the same thing.
Hold on, wait. I just gotta say, you're going on record and saying 2001 did something better than Quest for Fire. Do you really want to make that statement?
We rushed to the exact same gag.
You can use this as the bite for this episode. I'm going to go on the record and say that as much as I love Ron Perlman, and I think he really actually does look like a caveman, and that everyone should see Quest for Fire if only for the opening Ember sequence in the swamp, that 2001, runs blocks around most other sci-fi movies that came out after,
This hot take is going to blow up our TikTok.
This is
I try not to be too political.
Unless it's my voice, it's not going to blow up. Apparently,
we'll get into that. We'll get into that off mic. It's a weird phenomenon, but
right.
So
he said that the monkeys were looking for the bone, and
Haywood Floyd. So the Haywood Floyd sequence. Obviously, the big thing I want to touch on with that we haven't talked about yet, the sequence with Stanley Kubrick's daughter calling him via the video call, which we now look at and go, oh, they predicted Skype. But actually, video calling was pretty close on the horizon when 2001 came out, but nobody liked it. Like, they tested the technology, and people were just like, this is weird. This makes me uncomfortable. I don't like being watched. So it just
I still don't like it.
There are so many kind of weird anecdotes of, like, tech history. Like, 2000, the big thing that you see in this, because I think the Haywood Floyd sequence is all about showcasing the tech of the future, whether it's, the floating pen, the food boxes, anything like that. One thing Arthur C. Clarke kind of talks about in his book, The Lost World of 2001, The Ultimate Log of the Ultimate Trip, is he kind of laments that he was like, in 1968, all of this stuff felt possible, and it felt like it was coming soon. And the only reason it didn't is we just stopped caring. Like that you would all, if you grew up in the 60s and you saw the moon landing, you were like, we're going to colonize space in the next 10 years. And in some senses we didn't because there were technical and logistical issues, but another reason why we didn't is we just didn't care anymore. Like it's not exciting to the American public anymore. You know?
Right. There was like I imagine after Vietnam, there was an overwhelming sense of apathy and hopelessness, and
Well,
that
I mean, I think
nothing you actually try to change will change.
I think that's part of it, but I also think the other part is there was a lot of retreating into the past. I think there was a lot of, I mean, when you think about it, like the 80s, even though people think of it as a bit of an optimistic time, there was this idea of like going back to the 50s, right? Going back
No,
to the good old
totally. The
days.
most regressive, depressing, bleak outlook
Yeah.
on our future we've ever had.
It's
Well, until recently when we did
Which
the
brings
the
us to this
sequel.
point. Yeah.
But that is kind of the thing. Like, I think that there's also these dueling attitudes. I think that in the 50s and 60s, I mean, one of the great things at that 2001 exhibit that they did at the Museum of the Moving Image was kind of trying to set the template for what our mentality was about the future and space exploration. And before you walked into the 2001 exhibit, they had screens showing like other science fiction films or science-oriented films. And one of them they showed, and they're my favorite things to watch, was those old Walt Disney Disneyland TV specials called and you can go on Disney Plus and watch them now unless they've taken them down for tax purposes. But I don't think so, because no, they don't have to pay residuals to anyone in them because they're all dead. But if you can look up Man in Space and Mars and Beyond, and what it was like Walt Disney would come on your TV in a week, on a given week, and go, we're going to tell you all the potential of the future. We're going to tell you how rockets will work. We're going to tell you how satellites will work. We're going to tell you about planets. And it made people, the average person, go, yay, forward is good. Progress is good. We want this. Now, admittedly, if you watch Man in Space or Mars and Beyond, there is a little hiccup because he does have Wernher von Braun come out. But we weren't totally sure what he did at the time. We didn't have the full records. But you watch those and there was this optimism. And we lost that. We lost an interest in wanting to do more. And you still see it now in how we present. Like, there's the big, not to get too off topic, but like the big thing that came out was fairly recently. There's a scientist at Harvard who figured out how to reverse some of the elements of aging in mice and then in primates, right? And it seems clear that like it may not happen in our lifetimes, but eventually they're going to be able to do that. And when you saw the articles, you saw comments on the articles of a lot of people going, I wouldn't want that. Why would we want to do that? We shouldn't be able to do that. And you're like, well, that's part of the reason why we don't have all the advances we have, is like at a certain point there became this idea of like progress and getting better and improving and doing more was undesirable, and staying where we're at and maintaining what we have and just doing things the way we've always done them was the better approach. And I think that is the thing that Arthur C. Clarke is writing from the vantage point of when he's talking about why their vision of the future didn't come to fruition.
Well, isn't that the fucking sad thing of it? Is that back in the day you'd have Walt Disney come out. Rich people used to be guys like Walt Disney who'd like, I'm going to make a TV show every week and tell you about how we're going to progress and make things better for the future. And now the rich guys we got are fucking apartheid fail sons who buy social media and post dipshit fucking neo-Nazi tweets. Where you're just like, well, this rich people used to be a better breed of insane.
You made better public speakers.
You made the joke before. You were evoking the Walt Disney frozen head. The only reason that rumor starts is because Walt Disney himself was such an avid futurist, right? And had
Everyone just assumed he did that, yeah.
Because it was around the time, like, technically the first human being to be cryogenically frozen, that doesn't happen until like 2 or 3 years after Walt Disney dies. So, that.
Well, I thought the first one was Link.
Yeah, we know.
Was what?
Was Link. You never saw Encino Man?
No, okay, I got what you're saying. For a minute, I was thinking of like Link in Hyrule, and I'm like, I guess. I mean, I've played Ocarina of Time. I know what you mean. But
he woke up in Encino and had a good time.
But really, like, there was that futurist element, and I think we lost that. But even then, at the same time, as optimistic as the Haywood Floyd sequences are, a lot of the humor in these scenes comes out of the banality of it all, right? The humor is, when when Haywood Floyd is talking to his daughter on the video call, and she's like, "Are you coming to my party?" And he goes, "I can't, honey. I'm traveling." And you're watching a fucking planet pass behind his window, and he's talking like he's on a train to Pacoima. Also that video.
He's also performing his performance in this movie is like he walked off of the set of a completely different movie.
Yes. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Onto this very strange movie, giant, bizarrely lit, kind of surreal movie set.
Yeah, and he plays Floyd so matter of fact disinterested, which I love. We also in that video call get his daughter saying "See you next Wednesday," which is an ordinary line that means nothing to anyone else, but for whatever reason, John Landis latched onto it and put it in every one of his movies.
Well, because this is a movie that starts off with men in monkey suits, and that's something that John Landis has a real kink for. There's something else he was a lot more interested in, but we don't talk about that without lawyers present.
Nope. We say nothing actionable on this podcast. So I guess unless there's more thoughts on Haywood Floyd, we should move on to touching on the main sequence, the Hal sequence, the entire.
I mean, the most iconic thing in the movie. Like, I mean, that's just.
Sorry, Ian?
The only thing I'll say about this, what we were talking about, is just that this was the moment I got to watch 2001 last week at my friend's space, projected on a wall. It was the biggest. I'd never seen it 70 millimeter. I'd never seen it bigger than a TV. And this was the first time watching it where this whole sequence where they discover the monolith on the moon, and you sort of see the individual reactions of all the people, and one person takes a photo. This was the first time that whole sequence really landed with me and hit me. And to me, it's a really strong argument for making sure you see the movie as big as possible if you ever see it in your life. Because it was just a lot clearer what was even happening visually and how scary that moment is and how intimidating. And then how funny it is the way they react to it, even though the music is terrifying. Yeah. It really hit for the first time. Just wanted to say that.
Oh, of course. Now, as for the whole main Hal sequence, I mean, look, we could talk about this for hours. We could probably exceed the runtime of the film talking about it. We could be like that.
Easily.
We could be that sketch from The State, which is setting the world record for most time spent talking about the movie Paris, Texas. Like, it's not impossible, but to keep it brief, like, it's been talked about a lot, but my biggest thing, the entire Hal storyline is, I think when I first watched it, the first couple times I watched it as a younger person, it was very clearly, our heroes are the humans, and Hal is a robot that's gone crazy, right? He's bad guy. He must be stopped because he's trying to kill our guys. And as I've watched it more and more as I've gotten older, I recognize Hal's fight for survival. And now, when I watch it, Hal being slowly unplugged, upsets me viscerally. When I saw it in 70... I'm serious, because he's killing him, and I got some.
That always the little
motherfucker deserved to die.
Well, hang on, Tom, but
Al is innocent.
Okay, but I got a bit of confirmation on that in a way of why it always bothered me, and it's not saying he's a great guy, but it's I was listening to the commentary, and Keir Dullea talked about the scene and how it always affected him, and the way he and Stanley talked about playing it, and it's not disputing the fact that Hal needed to die for the survival of the crew. He killed the crew. But what Keir Dullea tapped into that I was like, I'd never thought of it this way before, but I went, yeah, that's exactly why this scene's upsetting. Is he said, when we played it like Of Mice and Men. I was George, and Hal was Lenny. And early on, I'm showing him my drawings. We're talking about chess. This is my companion, and I have seen all of the bad things he did, and I am telling him, look at the water. I'm going to tell you about the rabbits. And him saying, Hal, sing for me, is this moment of, it is George and Lenny. I
don't know, man.
Well,
no, he's like, we're gonna buy a nice farm, right? We're gonna go on the farm.
Listen, I get where you're coming from, and again, everyone's got their own views on art and everything, but that's kind of taken away how calculated Hal is in killing every single person for no reason.
But here's the thing, this is the key thing. I mean, with the whole film, is the idea of like this fight for survival, right? And I think that Hal knowing that they are going to kill him, right? That Hal is, that the crew does not recognize how much of a life form Hal is, and the idea that when they go into the pod, they think they can just switch him off, right? When they go, Hal, are you listening? And they unplug Hal's audio, and Hal does not reveal. Hal can read their lips and see that they're saying, turn the pod or turn off the lights. I forget what the line is. And he just doesn't tell them because he now knows they're going to try and kill me. And again, this is not to suggest that, that Hal isn't a villain per se. He is a villain, but what I'm saying is more the fact that, like, the first time I watched it as a kid, it was the idea of, like, this is a machine gone rogue. And I think that
Right.
now when I watch it, I kind of see in it the idea of, like, right, that we created a technology that is self-aware enough that it's not just that we can't control it, it's that the act of trying to callously control it dooms us more.
But see,
Right.
isn't that? But see,
There's a
that's
survival instinct.
Yeah.
But see, that feels like it's missing a part of what's kind of going on here. Is that they didn't make him that way. He evolved because they passed the monolith. Like, they basically entered into a radioactive zone and he evolved, which is what the monolith does. This isn't their fault. He turns into a murderer. So
Is that my understanding of the movie was always that because they were growing near to the monolith, things were going wrong in the spaceship, and that partially explains his response. I never understood it to be that Hal has literally evolved in real time because of the presence of this monolith.
that's how I viewed it, just because of they give you that bit of they send the readings that Hal gave them about the ship, the piece of the ship that's going to break, to Earth, and they use their Hal model, and they come with a different, like, well, no, your Hal is wrong. Like, none of these numbers make sense, which is
Right.
just Hal is evolved, and Hal's planning some shit.
He's been given awareness.
He's been given awareness. He's showing that he doesn't really understand why they're doing this mission, why this robot would be questioning the mission, should be setting off alarm bells. He's kind of going rogue. He's like, this is a stupid mission.
But isn't that so sad in and of itself that it's not that he's being turned into like a sort of sinister character, but that he's this vessel for life that is suddenly given life and has, what else are you to do when you have life but to fight for your own survival?
I mean, in a way,
his hand is forced, right?
He made his own issue, though. That's the thing, is that he is responsible for his own downfall. They're not gonna shut him off for no reason. They're like, he's broken. Like, this is going to be bad for us if we cannot rely on him. They have to take matters into their own hands. Hal is the cause of his own downfall, and it's because of the monolith evolving him, which is, as this movie's shown, when an unsentient being evolves, the first thing it does is it tries to kill something else. It's like I get it, but also Hal is such a villain. I really can't feel bad for him. Like, it's all his fault.
Look, whether or not you're sympathetic to Hal is its own thing, and that's a personal thing. For me, that.
No, I know that's.
But I'm saying, for me, the reason that final scene with Hal is so effective is that it would be very easy to just have a scene where you pull the plug or where you push the button, right?
Totally. Or where you think you killed it, but then it's back and he tries to kill you again.
Like, or something where it's just like, oh, hey, we got to drop a bomb in the center, and it's the fact that it's slow. Yeah. That is the thing that on later viewings unsettles me, is the fact that Hal, when he's saying, like, I'm scared, Dave, I'm scared. And what you don't know, and why it's so troubling and unsettling, is that you don't know, is Hal sentient enough to be scared, or is Hal calculating enough to think that saying I'm scared will play to his sympathies, will play to Bowman's sympathies enough to get him to stop, and also raises the question, in a sense, as human beings,
are we
us saying I'm scared a truly soulful thing or a calculated tactic? Like, it
totally.
I think the thing that that makes that scene so effective, I mean, I think it's beautifully shot and everything about that, but it is just a matter of, like, what that does so well as you're powering him down, and obviously he's singing Bicycle Bill and all that. It does throw a little rock out there of, like, hey, we're going to give you about 5 minutes where you have to process the nature and meaning of consciousness. You just got to sit through that, and you got to think about it, and we're not going to give you an answer, We're not going to tell you one way or the other. You just kind of have to see how you feel about it. And I think that, my feelings on that scene have evolved over the time. And honestly, my feelings on that scene probably will evolve even more over time. I may not be so affected by it, or I may not feel so sympathetic toward it over time. But I think that one of the marks of this film and its quality is the fact that, like, you can feel differently about it over time.
The Of Mice and Men style death, I think is. I also heard that interview where he describes that that's the way he played that scene, and when he described it totally clicked with me that this is a sort of type of murder in a movie that I've become accustomed to seeing, like the stabbing in Saving Private Ryan on the stairs, and it's slow, and he's like shushing him. That really disturbed me as a kid. And I think 2001, this death scene was the first time I'd ever seen that in a movie. So it really hit me, the idea that until then, watching Dragon Ball Z or whatever, the enemy is extremely clear, and the enemy is going to try and kill you until his last breath and say a bunch of scary stuff. The idea that the enemy is singing a children's nursery rhyme because it's essentially a child was really a lot to wrap my head around. And it still worked on me this time. I wasn't sure if it would hit for me.
Especially the fact that, like, he's reduced to singing a nursery rhyme, and the idea of, like, you're slowly dismantling him, right? And that Bowman doesn't even necessarily know, is there an amount that I can unplug that maybe is there a way I can just lobotomize him a little bit? He doesn't know. And all he knows is, I have to eliminate this threat. And it's just such a compelling scene. Now, last thing, because we've been talking a while, but we should touch a little bit more, if anybody has any more thoughts on the final sequence, the Stargate sequence, those incredible painted on glass visuals as he's entering the Stargate, and then obviously being in the human zoo and becoming the Star Child, not the guitarist for Kiss, a different Star Child.
Well, I don't think this Star Child hates trans people, so
I completely forgot he tweeted that, and he did indeed tweet that. Any final thoughts on the Stargate and the human zoo and the Star Child?
Did you guys see High Life, the Claire Denis movie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love Beau Travail. I did feel I was sort of flashing back to Mia Goth in High Life because she undergoes a similar sequence. Obviously, the visuals are completely different, but the sensation of traveling at warp speed and that there's a lot of pressure and it's kind of, you're not sure if the person's going to die or not. I did, even though I was flashing back to that more recent movie, watching 2001, I was thinking this is the best iteration of this. Even just how quickly they cut back to the pilot and the kinds of faces he's making and how much pain it seems like he's experiencing really hit me a lot harder this time than when I'd seen it when I was younger. It's very scary.
And it's
I really
aided by
I think the only the closest thing to come to it is what Nolan did in Interstellar in the first black hole sequence, and the bit when Matt Damon blows up the fucking ship on accident. I always forget Matt Damon's in that movie. Mm-hmm. Every time I see commercials for Oppenheimer, I'm like, oh, this is the second time he's worked with Nolan. It's weird to always think about. But when the ship and McConaughey has to like match the speed of the ship as it's spinning out of space, and he gets that like pressure and pain of super fast space travel. So so I kind of dig where you're coming from with the High Life thing. Yeah,
I think the other thing that this sequence does so wisely, and part of it comes down to the design of the spacesuits, the fact that they don't look like actual spacesuits, the fact that they could design a suit that essentially works best for a moment like this with that visor and everything. But the other thing that works so well in this sequence is that Kubrick uses these very abstract visuals, right? And these visual representations of what's happening. And why that works so well to me is that Keir Dullea does not know Bowman does not know what he's going through, and we do not know what he's going through. We are operating on the same limited information, and that means when we see those his head shaking or those frozen visions of his horrified face, maybe it's pain, maybe it's fear, we don't know what. But the big thing is we get no bearing because we either cut to weird, trippy lava lamp visuals or light flashes, and then we come back to our main character who is also confused. So we, as the viewer, are like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah,
and the only familiar sight is also a confused man.
And the only cue as to maybe if he's experiencing anything different is that his response is extreme. He's giving an extreme visual response that would suggest he's feeling something that we can't see just based on these visuals, which makes it a lot scarier to me. It's a very scary sequence.
You know, and listen, I know that people in 68 went to see this high, and I have to imagine some people just had to leave at this. Some people getting stoned and seeing this in 68 were like me seeing Gemini Man in high frame rate. They just had to get up at a certain point and go.
Gotten nauseous for sure.
Yeah.
I think a few of them committed some murders in Chatsworth, but that's another story.
And obviously there was, you know, it concludes with him becoming a higher life form and all of that. And I think that it was certainly easy for people in 68 to watch that and go, I don't know what the hell's going on, and to look for an answer. For me, it's just at that point, it just becomes an experience, right? Like,
he evolved, guys. Just roll with it.
Once he goes into the Stargate, it's no longer about trying to solve the puzzle. It's just kick back, take the ride.
You never turned into a star baby on a Saturday night? Come on.
I will say this was the first ending to a movie I'd ever seen that was this obtuse and this like sort of esoteric or ambiguous or open to interpretation, and it always fell a little flat with me watching it this time. I think being as open-minded as I was, it really hit. I think what worked for me is less the sort of content of that whole sequence and more just that visually it's able to tie back into the whole. The fact that the room he's in looks so similar to the design of the spaceship that we see earlier in the movie, it at least gave me this feeling that even if I don't fully understand the sort of logistically what's happening or on paper what's happening, visually I feel that there's some sort of intention and full circle quality to the coming back to this kind of space. And I felt satisfied watching it. I felt happy. Also, the shot looking through the spacesuit at himself old.
Yes. Yeah.
It doesn't get a lot better than that. That's pretty, I don't know what more you want.
Well, you know, just you think about the way movies were in America at the time. You know, foreign films could have abstract endings like this. This wasn't really an ending you would get in American movie, like
100%.
Really at the time. You know, like Mike said, the year before was the year that killed Hollywood. So we'll start getting endings like this a lot more, where you kind of just leave going, I don't know what happened. Like,
it's my favorite kind of ending. That's all I want. You know, I want to walk out scratching my head, thinking about it a month later. I'm talking to my friend, like, what I think that was.
So to wind us down, as we always do, Tom, how do you think 2001: A Space Odyssey did at the Academy Awards?
I mean, I'm gonna go ahead and say it probably got the Golden Goose Egg.
That is incorrect, actually.
Because I know there was no visual effects awards at the time.
There was.
Well, no, the Planet of the Apes thing was an honorary award.
I know. I'm talking. That was makeup. There was a visual effects award.
That
is to date.
That's true.
The only to date, he's dead. That is the only Oscar that Stanley Kubrick ever received.
Hey, don't cut him short. There's always time.
There's always another side of the wind. So to be clear, 2001: A Space Odyssey was not nominated for Best Picture, which is interesting because years later, Clockwork Orange is. So the Academy really shifts in a couple of years.
That's really interesting.
We've talked about this Oscar year before, Tom, because this is the same year as David Holzman's Diary. So it was not nominated for Best Picture. The Best Picture nominees that year were Funny Girl, The Lion in Winter, Rachel, Romeo and Juliet, the Zeffirelli one, and the winner, Oliver. Of those, Funny Girl is in the National Film Registry as well. 2001: A Space Odyssey, however, was nominated for Best Director, which it lost to Oliver.
Of course.
It was nominated.
Fairly.
Weirdly, despite being based on short stories, it was nominated for Best Original Screenplay, which it lost to The Producers, which is also in the registry. The one that gets me angriest, it was nominated for Best Art Direction, but lost to Oliver. Bullshit. Absolutely not.
That's insane. That's insane.
It won Best Visual Effects, beating out the only other nominee, Ice Station Zebra. So, which, I love Ice Station Zebra.
I gotta see that. What is that? It's a great name.
Oh, I mean, look, it's a film of its time, but it's a lot of fun. Ian, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you took the time, that you hung out so long to talk about this film. Why don't you throw out you got any plugs for anything you're working on, anything you did work on, any social media? Plug away. This is your time.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, okay. I got a couple things in the churning. I got a short that came out with my comedy group Simpletown. It's online starting today. So by the time this goes to air, we'll have been online for a second. It's called La Piscina, sort of a play on La Piscine. It's vaguely a satire of art house movies, about an incestuous group of siblings. So that's on Vimeo and YouTube, La Piscina Simpletown. And then I'm editing right now a documentary about my grandma and her experiences being abducted by aliens when she was a child. And I shot that over last summer, and now I'm editing it. So hopefully, only a couple months after this episode comes out, people will have that as a reference point for me as well. It's called "What Happened to Bobby."
And any socials you want to plug, anything like that, or no? You want people to leave you alone and not know what you're doing?
People can type my name in. I'm on Instagram. I'm Lauren Michaels. I'm the only person that got that name. And if you want to buy that name from me for a bunch of money, then you're also welcome to do that.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you will come back on future seasons. We got a lot of interesting stuff that lays ahead. So thank you so much for doing this. It was great to.
I'd love to. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, man.
It was great to catch up. Ian, we will see you around, but everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and me, who can submit their nominations for the registry in the form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of every episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. The only criteria? It must be an American film that's at least 10 years old. Here are today's picks.
So, interestingly enough, I've obviously known we were going to do 2001 for a very long time, and I have had a lot of time to think about what my registry pick would be for 2001, given how much I love this movie. So I'm, surprised that the movie I'm actually going to name to the registry, and that I do thoroughly believe should be in the National Film Registry, is not a movie that I was a fan of even 2 years ago. But it just fits. It is, in line with 2001 in that sprawling sense of covering all of human and cosmic history, but, and the philosophical elements while being much more down to earth and much more grounded. And it's a film that I think is an extraordinary now, having rewatched it this year for an episode of our show, I think is it's a masterpiece. And it's my favorite film by this filmmaker, and I don't really like this filmmaker terribly much. But I think The Tree of Life by Terrence Malick is just a remarkable film. I think it captures a moment in time and depicts a period of American history very well, but at the same time feels remarkably timeless. I think that you could tell me that movie got made in 2005, 2011, 2023, and I'd buy it. I think that it is very much in the same vein of 2001 in terms of being able to watch something and just let it wash over you. And I think that much like 2001, it is a thing that you look at and go, inarguably, this is a work of art, right? I mean, it won the Palme d'Or, and, not this past Sight and Sound poll, but the one before it, people were like, well, of course, it's one of the greatest films of all time. And I think that its legacy will only grow over time. I don't love the entire filmography of Terrence Malick, but if we are going to preserve something, I think it's one of the best American films of the 2010s. I think it's one of the best films Malick's ever made. It's just a remarkable work and a uniquely American work. So I think The Tree of Life should be in the National Film Registry.
All right, so this is just a case of I'm just such bad timing, because if we did this episode a year from now, I could put up Interstellar as my pick. Because I mentioned it many times in the episode, it feels like Nolan is in a Kubrickian space in terms of how they make movies, and Interstellar feels like, in many ways, is working in realms that Kubrick is working in this movie. So much so that it's about higher beings helping us get to a better place. But I can't do that. So my pick is my favorite movie from this filmmaker. Unlike Mike, this is a filmmaker I do actually like a lot. It is, I think it's safe to say it's probably my favorite is space-bound movie of the 21st century. It's a movie that struck me when I saw it in high school. It just hit me right where I lived and burrowed into my brain and stayed there. And it's one that every time I rewatch it, I like it even more. It's a movie that's not completely agreed upon by people. There is some divisiveness to it as with its structure and the way things unfold in its third act, but I think the third act is pretty brilliant. My pick is Sunshine by Danny Boyle. I love that fucking movie so much. It's gorgeous, it's haunting, it's thrilling, it's smart. I think there are parallels to 2001 in there that are very interesting, especially with the way I believe it's Mark Strong is the bad guy at the end, kind of playing the HAL 9000 of the movie, but really getting into how humanity's its own worst enemy, and we have to get past that to actually achieve anything. I think it's Cillian Murphy's very few times is he the lead of a movie, and he kills it in this movie. The first time any of us realized, oh, this Chris Evans kid can actually act. He's astounding in the movie. The whole cast: Michelle Yeoh, Cliff Curtis, Mark Strong, all these people. Danny Boyle just directs the absolute hell out of it. He's a guy that's, he's a British filmmaker, so there's some like you can't put Trainspotting in here, I don't think. And there's a few movies of his you can't put in there, but then you got stuff where you can, and I think he's one of the best filmmakers of the last 30 years. I want to see him get represented. And I think Sunshine's his crowning achievement. At some point, I'll find a way to put Steve Jobs up for something, but Sunshine is unbelievable, and it does feel a little underrated in the film world. I think if you haven't seen it, give it a shot. It's an amazing movie, and one that I think everybody should go out and see right now. I don't know why you're listening to us when you could be watching Sunshine. So that's my pick.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Thank you again to Ian Faria for joining us. Next week, our adventure takes us from space to Skull Island. Graham Skipper is our guest for 1933's King Kong. Don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.